How did people in the 1800s build huge cities, run factories, move goods across continents, and maintain water, gas, and canal networks without anything close to modern communication? Old photographs show monumental buildings, illuminated streets, crowded stations, huge industrial halls, and infrastructure stretching for thousands of miles. But much of this world seems strangely advanced for the period we were taught to picture. So what was everyday life really like in the world now associated with Tartaria, and what happened to it before the Great Reset? Chapter 1. The forgotten world of Tartaria. The first question that comes to mind is hard to shake. If people in the 1800s really lived in such a limited world, how did they leave so much behind that still feels difficult to explain? We keep finding the same problem wherever we look. Enormous buildings rise over old photographs of cities that were supposedly still developing. Their ceilings stretch 12 or 16 feet above the floor. Windows climb almost the full height of a room. Stone facades carry details that would cost a fortune to reproduce today. Railway stations, canals, bridges, tunnels, paved streets, water systems, and massive public buildings seem to appear almost everywhere we turn. Then the questions begin piling up. Who was doing all of this work? Where did the skilled labor come from? How were tons of stone, iron, timber, machinery, and decorative material moved so quickly between places separated by hundreds or even thousands of miles? And there is something else that keeps bothering us. Buildings in completely different parts of the world often seem to share the same sense of proportion, the same enormous interiors, similar columns, arches, domes, geometric decoration, and carefully arranged streets. Different countries, different languages, different governments, yet strangely familiar results. None of this proves the grand stories told about Tartaria. That would be far too easy. But it does leave us with a 19th century that feels much harder to explain than the version most of us learned. Perhaps that is the more interesting question anyway. Forget the name Tartaria for a moment. Forget the arguments surrounding it. Look only at what remains. If these buildings, streets, photographs, machines, and transport systems belonged to everyday life, then what was that life really like? Because somewhere between the old photographs and the story we inherited, something does not quite fit. Chapter 2. A civilization more advanced than we were told, the strange feeling left by those old buildings becomes even harder to ignore once we leave their interiors and look at the world around them. The streets raise questions of their own. Instead of the crude tracks we might expect from the familiar picture of 19th century life, old city plans and photographs show broad avenues. Carefully measured gradients, buried drainage lines, sewers, water channels, and underground works stretching beneath entire districts. In several cities, portions of that infrastructure remained useful long after the people who installed it were gone. Even the width of certain boulevards feels curious when horse carts were supposedly the main concern. Some roads were laid out with remarkable symmetry, meeting at circles, squares, and central points before spreading outward in long, deliberate lines. Seen on a map, whole districts form radial shapes and geometric arrangements that hardly resemble settlements growing without careful planning. Traffic adds another layer to the puzzle. By the later 19th century, photographs show horse-drawn vehicles sharing busy roads with omnibuses, streetcars, and rail lines. Those streetcars could not simply be placed on a road and sent on their way. Tracks had to be installed, routes agreed upon, stops maintained, timetables followed, vehicles serviced, and, in some systems, cables or electrical equipment had to operate behind the scenes. Elevated railways added an even greater burden of construction and maintenance. Yet versions of these systems appeared across numerous cities within a relatively short period. We can explain each development separately, but seeing them together makes the pace of change feel extraordinary. The waterways make that feeling stronger. Britain once had thousands of miles of navigable canals, while Belgium, the Netherlands, France, China, and other regions depended on immense networks of their own. Barges carried quantities of grain, coal, timber, manufactured products, and raw materials that would have demanded lines of wagons over land. Locks controlled changing elevations, reservoirs supplied water when levels fell. Pumping equipment served difficult sections, warehouses and transfer points kept cargo moving. None of this worked through engineering alone. Someone had to collect tolls, repair gates, regulate passage, manage supplies, settle disputes, and keep commercial traffic from grinding to a halt. Then those waterways met much older land routes stretching across Eurasia. Caravanserais gave protected courtyards, storage rooms, water, shelter, and space for animals along heavily traveled corridors. Merchants carried Chinese goods westward, while European, Persian, Indian, Central Asian, and African products traveled in other directions. Currency changed hands, agreements crossed languages, cargo passed between jurisdictions. And journeys continued across distances that remain exhausting even with modern transport. Maybe the real surprise is not that earlier societies could achieve these things. We know they did. It is how easily we picture their world as disconnected and slow. Once the buildings, streets, railways, canals, ports, and caravan routes are viewed together, that picture begins to feel far too small. Whatever name we give this forgotten world, its people were moving through systems of connection far richer than the simple horse and wagon image suggests. And even that does not bring us to the strangest form of movement associated with this period. Because above those roads and waterways, another story was beginning to take shape. Chapter 3. The technology that shouldn't have existed. That last question takes us somewhere far stranger. Because those roads, canals, and railway lines may not have been the only ways people were experimenting with movement. By the middle of the 19th century, newspapers were already reporting balloon ascents and aerial exhibitions, while patent records contained designs for dirigibles and other steerable craft. Engineering journals discussed propulsion, navigation, gas production, stability, and ways of controlling machines once they left the ground. None of this means fleets of airships were quietly crossing the world, but it does reveal something easily missed. Controlled aerial travel was being taken seriously much earlier than the familiar story often makes it seem. World's fairs make that harder to overlook. Balloon demonstrations drew enormous crowds. Passengers were carried above exhibition grounds. And inventors openly presented ideas for navigating the sky. Paris became particularly associated with balloon experimentation, while similar ambitions appeared elsewhere. Old photographs add another curious detail. Rooftops sometimes carried tall masts, towers, platforms, and unusual metal structures whose purpose is no longer obvious. Many certainly had ordinary uses, yet beside everything else happening with aerial technology, they leave an intriguing question behind. Were some buildings occasionally adapted for experiments involving balloons or dirigibles? The mystery becomes more personal once we step back inside those enormous structures. Beneath the grand halls were deep basements, brick-vaulted chambers, drainage channels, service passages, pipe openings, iron mounts, and rooms built around machinery that had long since disappeared. Higher up, shafts traveled between floors, glazed courtyards pulled daylight into enormous interiors, and ventilation systems quietly moved air through spaces occupied by hundreds or thousands of people. Rooftops carried still more equipment: vents, tanks, chimneys, observatories, lightning protection, communication devices, and structures whose original roles can be difficult to recognize after generations of alteration. Even the decoration refuses to feel careless. Geometric borders, repeating circles, carefully measured arches, stars, grids, and balanced proportions appear again and again across distant cities. Much of this can be traced to shared architectural traditions and traveling craftsmen, But the precision still tells us something important. These buildings were not simply beautiful shells. They were carefully planned working environments shaped around light, water, heat, airflow, weight, movement, and machinery. And perhaps that is what makes them so difficult to dismiss. The technology does not always look futuristic because much of it was built directly into the walls. Once those systems disappeared, the empty shafts, sealed chambers, strange fittings, and altered rooftops remained behind, leaving us to wonder how much of their original purpose we still understand. Chapter 4. An industrial world that makes no sense. Those sophisticated buildings become even harder to understand when we consider what was happening inside the factories surrounding them. Photographs do not show modest workshops slowly learning how to mechanize. We see enormous halls crowded with belts, shafts, looms, presses, furnaces, lathes, pumps, and machinery stretching across entire floors. New England textile mills were already turning out vast quantities of cloth during the early 19th century. Britain had immense ceramic and glass industries, German foundries expanded rapidly, and chemical manufacturing was becoming increasingly organized across Europe. Each operation depended on far more than a clever machine. Workers needed training, replacement parts had to fit, raw materials had to arrive continuously, equipment required maintenance, and hundreds of separate jobs had to remain coordinated every working day. The precision involved is easy to underestimate. Machine tools allowed manufacturers to cut metal with very fine accuracy, while hydraulic equipment handled pressures and forces that demanded careful engineering. Electrical experiments, generators, motors, and industrial applications were developing well before electric lighting became common in ordinary homes. Standardized and interchangeable components also began transforming manufacturing during the 19th century, allowing pieces made separately to work together with far greater reliability. None of these developments appeared overnight, yet when we compress the period into a few photographs and dates, the speed can feel almost impossible. Commerce makes the picture larger still. Cotton crossed the Atlantic toward British mills. Tea traveled from China into European markets. Grain moved from Eastern Europe toward growing cities, and manufactured goods returned along many of those same routes. Merchants were not simply exchanging objects across a table. Bills of exchange, credit arrangements, marine insurance, contracts, commodity prices, shipping schedules, warehouses, brokers, customs offices, and banking houses held international trade together. Information traveled through letters, newspapers, couriers, shipping agents, semaphore networks, and eventually the telegraph, which dramatically accelerated a system that was already remarkably connected. Market buildings reveal how organized that world had become. Goods were weighed against agreed standards, inspected, recorded, stored, auctioned, taxed, insured, and redirected toward distant buyers. Ports handled cargo belonging to merchants who might never meet one another. Financial agreements could cross borders while ships carrying enormous investments disappeared beyond the horizon for months. Perhaps that is the part worth lingering over. Nothing here requires a forgotten industrial civilization to explain it. Yet the real 19th century is already far stranger and more capable than the simplified version many of us carry in our heads. Behind every factory photograph stood an enormous web of workers, engineers, merchants, financiers, transporters, clerks, and institutions keeping everything moving. And once we ask who coordinated that web, another question follows naturally. What kind of society was capable of organizing life on such a scale? Chapter 5. How was this entire world connected? And that question takes us beyond factories and markets, because keeping such a complicated world functioning required something less visible than machinery: organization. 19th century society is usually described through changing governments, fading aristocracies, expanding voting rights, and a growing middle class. Yet daily life depended on another layer that rarely got the same attention. Cities needed surveyors, engineers, clerks, inspectors, commissioners, accountants, architects, contractors, magistrates, and countless officials simply to keep public works functioning. Rail gauges had to be agreed upon, canals regulated, construction inspected, property recorded, trade measured, and disputes settled. Grand civic buildings were therefore not merely monuments. Behind their stone walls sat archives, meeting chambers, technical departments, registries, courts, and offices processing an extraordinary amount of information. Alongside government stood an equally crucial network of private and professional groups. Engineering institutions exchanged technical papers. Scientific societies circulated discoveries. Merchant associations shared commercial intelligence. Trade organizations established practices between members, while fraternal orders and learned clubs linked individuals across borders. Their influence could travel farther than political boundaries, allowing methods developed in one city to be studied and adapted elsewhere. Rather than pointing to a single secret authority, the surviving trail reveals something arguably more impressive: overlapping circles of expertise capable of keeping distant places in conversation with one another. Ideas traveled through those circles with surprising speed. Books, newspapers, technical journals, letters, sheet music, catalogs, architectural drawings, and fashion plates crossed oceans aboard regular steamship routes. Publishers maintained foreign contacts, translators worked quickly when demand justified it, traveling performers carried music between capitals, scientists corresponded directly with colleagues they might never meet. Once telegraph cables began shrinking communication times, the exchange became faster still. That helps explain why similar fashions, artistic movements, inventions, and scientific debates could surface thousands of miles apart without requiring some unknown communication device. Few events display this ability better than the great international exhibitions. The Crystal Palace of 1851 brought together thousands of exhibitors beneath a huge prefabricated iron and glass structure. Paris later staged exhibitions on an even grander scale, while Chicago's 1893 World's Columbian Exposition assembled buildings, machinery, electric displays, transportation exhibits, art, and visitors from across the globe. What feels almost unbelievable is not that these places appeared by magic, but that enormous teams could design components elsewhere, transport them to one site, assemble everything under strict deadlines, operate the grounds for millions of visitors, and then dismantle much of it afterward. The Crystal Palace itself was eventually moved and rebuilt elsewhere, a reminder of how confidently modular construction was already being used. Home life adds the final piece. Evening streets in major cities could be illuminated by gas supplied through buried mains. Water arrived through reservoirs, aqueducts, pumps, and extensive distribution pipes. Sewers carried waste away, while larger houses and public buildings used boilers, radiators, ventilation shafts, speaking tubes, service bells, and eventually electrical wiring. None of these conveniences appeared everywhere at once, and poorer districts often waited far longer than wealthy neighborhoods. But their spread still demanded enormous investment and constant technical attention. Perhaps that unevenness gives us the most revealing clue. This was not a mysterious world where everyone possessed technology beyond anything recorded in history. It was a world undergoing change at breathtaking speed, with old and new living beside each other. A horse cart could pass beneath telegraph wires. A gaslit house might stand near a neighborhood without proper sanitation. An ancient trade route could feed directly into a steam-powered port. Seen together, those contrasts make the 19th century feel less primitive than unfinished and enormous interconnected machine being rebuilt while it was already running. And once we understand how closely its institutions, information, utilities, and commerce were tied together, the next mystery becomes much harder to avoid: what happened to that world? And why does so much of it seem to disappear from view? Chapter 6. What happened to all that knowledge? By nightfall, the connected world we have been following did not simply shut down. In the larger cities, darkness increasingly became something people could push back. Gas lamps lined important streets decades before electric lighting became familiar, supported by gasworks, buried mains, valves, lamp crews, maintenance schedules, and an entire municipal operation most pedestrians never saw. Later came arc lamps, powerful enough to illuminate stations, squares, factories, exhibition grounds, and busy commercial districts. Electricity complicated matters further, demanding generators, wiring, regulators, switches, trained operators, and constant supervision. None of this appeared everywhere at the same moment, yet by the late 19th century, certain urban centers were already glowing after sunset in ways that can feel surprisingly modern when we see the photographs today. Maybe this is where the question changes. Instead of asking whether such technology existed, we begin wondering how much knowledge was needed to keep it working. Every illuminated avenue depended upon technicians. Every water main required engineers and repair crews. Every boiler, elevator, telegraph line, railway signal, bridge, and factory machine belonged to a larger body of practical understanding. Thousands of workers knew how to repair things that have since disappeared. Craftsmen understood materials we rarely use in the same way. Draftsmen worked without digital tools. Surveyors established long routes using instruments that look painfully simple beside modern equipment. Their methods were recorded, taught, improved, and passed from one generation to another. But knowledge does not always survive simply because it once worked. Technologies can vanish when economics change. Skilled trades can shrink until hardly anyone remembers the old methods. A system may be replaced not because it failed, but because another becomes cheaper, faster, easier to expand, or more profitable. Gaslighting surrendered streets to electricity. Canals lost enormous amounts of traffic to railways and later highways. Horse infrastructure disappeared beneath automobile cities. Elaborate masonry became expensive beside steel, reinforced concrete, standardized components, and modern construction schedules. Buildings that once depended on passive ventilation were altered for mechanical heating and cooling. With every replacement, another collection of skills became less necessary. That may explain part of the strange feeling we experience around surviving 19th century structures. We can reproduce their appearance, but doing so today can cost staggering amounts because the economic world that supported such craftsmanship has changed. Stone carvers, ornamental plasterers, specialist metalworkers, timber craftsmen, and armies of relatively inexpensive labor no longer exist at the same scale. The knowledge was not necessarily erased, much of it became commercially impractical. Scattered through old manuals, technical journals, archives, workshops, and professions that moved toward different methods. Still, something unsettling remains in that transition. Progress is usually remembered as a clean staircase, each generation standing comfortably above the previous one. Real history is messier. Useful techniques disappear. Infrastructure is abandoned. Excellent buildings are demolished. Once common skills become specialist knowledge. Entire transport routes fall silent because the economy chooses another direction. People living through those changes may not even realize what is being lost until decades later. That leaves us with the physical remnants. Old railway stations still carry whispers across vaulted halls through carefully shaped acoustics. Victorian waterworks continue serving communities long after their builders died. Former factories survive with enormous windows positioned to provide daylight before cheap electric illumination. Canals remain cut across landscapes after their commercial importance has faded. Beneath streets, generations of pipes, tunnels, drains, foundations, and sealed passages overlap like pages that were never completely erased. None of this proves that a technologically superior civilization disappeared during some forgotten reset. The documented 19th century already gives us something more interesting than that. Societies capable of remarkable engineering while still struggling with poverty, disease, pollution, dangerous labor, overcrowding, and enormous inequality. Sophistication and hardship existed side by side. And perhaps that contradiction is why these photographs continue to bother us. The people staring back at them were not waiting helplessly for the modern world to arrive. They were already solving difficult problems with the tools, institutions, knowledge, and resources available to them. Some solutions endured, others were replaced. A few became so unfamiliar that we now struggle to recognize their original purpose. So when we ask what happened to all that knowledge, the answer may not be a single catastrophe or deliberate act of forgetting. It may be something quieter and, in its own way, stranger. Civilizations remember selectively. They preserve whatever remains useful, abandon what no longer fits, rebuild over yesterday's systems, and eventually forget why certain things were made the way they were. The buildings remain after the craftsmen disappear. The tunnels outlive the engineers who understood every junction. Old photographs preserve machines whose operators left no voices behind. Streets retain patterns drawn for needs that vanished generations ago. And that leaves one question no archive can answer quite so comfortably. If so much ordinary knowledge can slip from everyday memory within only a century or two, how certain can we really be that we recognize everything the past has left beneath our feet? Well, if you've enjoyed watching this video, be sure to give it a like, share it, and subscribe. Thanks for hanging with us, and we'll see you soon in the next one.